Spanish Inquisition, Cecil Roth, let's go. The fact that the veins appeared to be of a bluer tinge in a person of fair complexion gave rise to the use of the term sangre azul by certain families of Castile who claim that they are uncontaminated by Moorish, Jewish, or other admixture. This in turn being adapted in English in reference to the blue-blooded aristocracy. Even this exiguous proportion of infidel blood, however, was sufficient to exclude a man from office to prevent natural affliction from finding its outlet in marriage, or to give a fatal turn to the suspicions of the Holy Office. There is one matter, on the other hand, in which the record of the Spanish Inquisition, as compared with the rest of Europe, shows up in a very good light, and this is in the attitude adopted towards witchcraft. It is likely that in a large number of instances, those inculpated actually believed that they could attain supernatural powers and magical qualities which they did not necessarily desire to exercise for their neighbor's good. It would seem that there had survived throughout Europe something of the ancient pre-Christian fertility cult, of which those accused of witchcraft were the last devotees. Their ceremonies were associated with this. The witches' Sabbath was an assemblage to carry out as rites. The evil one, with whom they were reported to have a pact and to conduct indecent orgies, was the representative of the ancient pagan deity to whom these rites were originally dedicated, now given by the church a Christian disguise and identified with Satan. Sir William Blackstone was laying down the law. Hold on, let me read this. From the date comparatively, few trials for witchcraft figure in the records of the Inquisition. In the 18th century, rationalists England and Scotland, with their estimated total of 300,000 victims in all, and even the American colonies, were cheerfully burning witches after preliminaries of revolting cruelty, and Sir William Blackstone was laying down the law that to deny the possibility, nay, actual existence of witchcraft, is at once flatly to contradict the revealed word of God. In Spain, on the other hand, the moderating influence of the Holy Tribunal remained preponderant, and though a few cases were brought before it, conviction ensued in none of them. In a Latin country in which, but there was much else with which the Holy Office occupied itself. In a Latin country in which normal obscenity assumed a theological form as automatically as it assumes a sexual form in the English-speaking world, the question of blasphemy was important. And a man who drew doubt upon his faith by shouting, "Renegio e Dios," when he was a temper, often repented it by being lashed through the streets in an auto de fe. There was the problem of evildoers who exported horses to France, possibly for the service of the Huguenot heretics. And the advance of the 18th century, the problem of the Jansenists and of the rationalists, and in the end of the Freemasons became more and more pressing. Okay. Let me see here. Okay. Looking up something here. Here, the populace seems to have been too uncivilized as yet to appreciate such an advanced product of European culture. When the first auto was staged 4 years later to chastise a few unimportant offenders, a motley crowd of Negroes and mulattoes assembled to pelt the victims with oranges and fruit, and it was necessary to intervene in order to carry out the scourgings with proper dignity. This period of comparative inactivity was of short duration. One day in August 1634, a Lima businessman denounced one of his business competitors on the ground that he had been unwilling to make a sale on Saturday, besides horrors of horrors, refusing to eat a rasher of bacon for his breakfast, Under torture, the accused person made admissions which implicated his employer and a couple of other persons. The latter, in turn, were forced to denounce others whom they suspected of being secret Jews. So the circle widened, and the Holy Office made preparations for its great drive. An inkling was given of what was contemplated by unusual activity in the Inquisitional headquarters, where fresh cells were prepared to accommodate the expected prisoners. When all was ready, the Inquisition pounced. On August 11th, 1634, between 12:30 and 2 o'clock, 17 arrests were made. The persons involved, including some of the most prominent merchants and businessmen in the city. Alright. 11 of them were burned, seven alive. Okay. Then asking for maize husks instead of his ration of bread, he made a rope from them by means of which he let himself down from the window of his cell. Instead of making good his estate, however, he visited other prisoners whom he tried to convert. He had been in prison for nearly 13 years when he was brought out to be relaxed. And to be relaxed means to be killed, or whatever. As the sentences were being read, a sudden wind tore away the awning from overhead. Overheard, "This is the Lord's doing," he exclaimed, "that I may look on him face to face." His two pathetic paper books were hung around his neck at the last in order to assist the flames. The proceedings at Lima had put the Tribunal of Mexico on guard. Here the first clue was given by the arrest of Gabriel de Granada, a child of 13 against whom suspicions had been roused for various actions which seemed to savor of Judaism. The poor boy, ruthlessly questioned, was compelled to make admissions which implicated no less than 108 persons in all, including his mother and the whole of his family. Wholesale arrests were immediately carried out. This complicidad constituting for some days the solitary topic of conversation in the city. Meanwhile, an embargo was placed on the immigration from the province without special license of any Portuguese, who were still regarded, not without cause, as particularly suspect in matters of faith. The result was an inquisitional persecution in which all her petty deceits were laid bare and repudiated in a public auto. Auto means being burned or whatever. It was related, indeed, that more than twice as many persons were present as the entire population of Gran Canaria. Okay. During the period of office as Inquisitor of the fanatical Bartholomew de Fonseca, the ferocity shown was outstanding. Autos of peculiar virulence took place in 1575 and 1578, and all told down to the year 1623. No less than 3,800 persons were tried. An increasingly large proportion of the victims were from a particularly pathetic class, the native St. Thomas Christians. Okay. In the autumn of 1659, sentence was at last pronounced: relaxation for divination and superstitious cures, which indicated a pact with the demon. In the centuries that had lapsed since the days of Ferdinand and Isabella, the population is computed to have declined by 50%, from 12 million to 6 million. That certain inmates of a nunnery in Congas who were notoriously possessed by demons should be induced during their moments of aberration to reveal the causes of the royal illness. His advice was followed, and the nuns obediently suggested that many years before their sovereign had been bewitched by the Queen Mother by means of a peculiar revolting potion administered in a cup of chocolate, with a little supplementary assistance some time later from the Queen herself. Okay. Ignorance, assimilation, and the continual immigration of the best brains of the country had sensibly weakened the force of Marianism. Within the next quarter of a century, the total reached 25 million, of which barely 500,000 found its way to the royal treasury. Okay. Fortunately, no Jewish blood was traceable in his veins, and though he was burned, the new Christians were saved. Alright. Let me see here. In 1718, over 50 natives of Braganza appeared at a single auto at Coimbra. And in the few succeeding years, that region continued to furnish 9/10 of the victims of the Northern Tribunal, 805 from the city itself, and nearly 2,000 from the surrounding district. At an auto held on May 25th, 1737, at Lisbon, whither it became customary at this period to send persons condemned by the other tribunals ad majorem de gloriam. All the 12 persons who were relaxed were from Celorico and Lamego, except one woman. Okay. This was Fray Jose Diaz Pimienta, a Cuban friar of old Christian extraction, who seems to have persuaded himself that if he became converted to Judaism, he need have no further worldly worries. At 15, he was a novice in a convent in the island of Cartagena, but got into such trouble for his precautiously dissolute manner of life that he fled to Corocoa, where he became converted to Judaism and married a Jewess. Okay. In all, during the 45 years reign of the first Bourbon ruler of Spain, 1,564 heretics were said to have been relaxed and 11,730 otherwise punished, an appalling total in the century of enlightenment when the encyclopedias were flourishing in France and the breath of religious liberty was sweeping through Europe. When several new Christians were relaxed on the fantastic charge of having scourged and burned an image of Jesus in a house in the Calle de las Infantas. Nevertheless, even Pombal could appreciate the potential utility of the Holy Office for political objects, and it was upon it that he relied in part in his struggle for the suppression of the Jesuits, whom he hated with a fanatical abomination. Finally, on May 23rd, 1773, all legal distinctions between old and new Christians were removed by law. The Marranos had always provided a majority of the victims, and as soon as they disappeared from the scene, the work of the Inquisition became negligible. And the Marranos is a group of Moors. A case in point was that of the Beata Dolores, an impostor who had left her father's house at the age of 12 to live with her confessor, had claimed continued and familiar intercourse with the Virgin, as well as an early marriage in heaven with the child Jesus, Saint Joseph, and Saint Augustine, having acted as witnesses. Every endeavor was made to induce her to profess penitence and thus save her from the agonies of the stake, but she refused to avail herself of the opportunity. On August 22nd, 1781, she was burned, and after having secured the preliminary grace of strangulation by a last-moment repentance. Not dissimilar from this was the case of Beata of Cuenca, Isabel Maria Jerez, who claimed that in order to be more completely united to her, Jesus had infused his blood and body into hers, so that she was adored as semi-divine by hundreds of followers. She died shortly after her arrest, impenitent, and in accordance with precedent, was subsequently burned in effigy in 1802, almost the last case of the sort on record. Not long before, a Judaizer named Lorenzo Beltran had been reconciled at an auto in Seville on March 31st, 1799. Okay. Yeah, a lot of people burned at the stake, talking this Jesus nonsense. Below this, the Hall of Judgment and its infamous appurtenances were discovered, including cells still containing human remains where the victims were immured until death relieved them from their sufferings. They were, it is true, provided with ventilation, but this was not for the benefit of the victims, but so as to ensure that the smell of the decomposing flesh should not offend the inquisitor's nostrils. In other cells were found about 100 living victims of all ages and both sexes, all as naked as the day they were born, and in the last stage of weaknesses. Among the instruments of torture with which the brave French soldiers made a few interesting experiments on the familiars and their superiors was a statue of the Virgin studded with spikes, which could be made to inflict a fatal embrace on its victims and so bring about an agonizing death. But the citizens of Madrid congratulated the Cortes on having ended the activities of an institution which for 3.5 centuries past had transformed men into tigers and prevented the progress of art and science in the country. The change between now and 100 years ago is not one of temperament. The only outstanding difference is that with the advance in civilization, instruments of destruction have attained so devastating a degree of perfection. Cortes, which made it unnecessary henceforth for candidates for admission to the corps of cadets to produce certificate of limpieza, a purity of blood, from any admixture of Jew and Moor, or from such as have been condemned by the Holy Office. The blood of martyrs is the seed of the church, in a sense rather different from that in which the phrase is generally intended. And Marranos, brought up in complete ignorance of the religion of their fathers, sedulously studied the ethics of faith and the sentences of the condemned in order to learn something of Jewish practice. It was founded to deal with, and the greatest part of its energies were directed against, a different category, forcible converts from Judaism and Islam who had not desired to enter the Catholic Church, who had little knowledge of Catholic ceremonial and doctrine, but whom the Inquisition tried to force into conformity with blood and fire. Okay. Nevertheless, it is possible to draw up an impressive list of persons of real eminence whose activities were cut short in the fires of the Quemadero, of others who were proceeded against, submitted to indescribable suffering, and narrowly escaped with their lives after years of imprisonment, of others again who were arranged after death, and whose bodies were dug up and burned, as they themselves would have been had they lived a little longer, and finally others who avoided arrest and condemnation only by a timely flight, and were relaxed in absentia. Garcia de Orta, whose bones were exhumed and burned after his death in India in 1580, was the greatest Portuguese scientist of the Renaissance and the founder of the study of tropical medicine. And of the great auto held at Seville in 1660, among the 30 persons burned in effigy were 2 at least of the highest reputation in intellectual circles: Dr. Melchor de Orobio, professor of medicine in the University of Seville and subsequently physician to the King of France, and Antonio Enriquez Gomez, a prolific writer and rival of Calderon for the favors of the theater-going public of Madrid. The extirpation, the expatriation, or stultification of intellects such as these, spread over a long period of years, cannot but have had a deleterious effect on Spanish and Portuguese cultural life. One may even go further: it was a crime against the human race as a whole. Now, I read that book for a lot of reasons. I read that book. When I read the book because, I had moved over to El Paso and I was being biased. I knew everything about the slave trade, but I knew nothing about the Spanish Inquisition. So I said, let me do some research. Let me buy a couple of books on it and see what we have. And that's what we round up. That's where this society is based off of. Definitely our law system was practiced and perfected during the course of the Inquisitions. And religion was the first form of law used before we divided church and state. We used that, yeah. Okay, and that's how we built our law system here in America. Not we, but Western civilization is built like that. Now we're talking about the Spanish Inquisition. We're not talking about the witch trials, the witch burnings that went on at the same time. And the African slave trade was going on during a lot of those years too. So there was a lot of death and a lot of murder going on all across the planet at that time. And I read that so you could go out there and, you know, be a little bit more intrigued and interested into history. And not only that, but as you have read, or as you have heard, there's many references to the Moors and other subgroups of the Moors that were boxed in with the Jews and kicked out of many different countries in many different time periods. Because we're talking about hundreds of years as this Inquisition went on. And there was a large decrease in the human race and a large stagnation in the progression of where our sciences could be. So, you know, I just put that out there so it can assist you with where we're at right now. And it can also assist you with some religion origins that people don't like to recognize. People like to turn a blind eye to. So that was the Spanish Inquisition by Cecil Roth. It's a very good book. Alright, and I got another hot one, another book coming up ASAP. Alright, so y'all check me out. Peace.